Hello, friends. This is Doug Scheibel, your free-range podcaster with Ethnos 360. Just want to say thanks again for coming today. Appreciate so much that you're listening to these and being an encouragement to me and to others. Very, very grateful for all the different folks that have given comments, and I appreciate it very much. Last week's lesson was probably is continuing on with this, is a little bit depressing. The requirements for approaching God were impossible to keep. They really were. All those commands that they were given, they were impossible to keep. But because God is merciful and because He's gracious, He provided a way for Israel to approach Him, but they had to approach Him on His terms, not on their own terms. They had to come to Him in a way that only would allow a sinner, somebody who's guilty, to approach God in a way that would keep them from being judged and punished right at that moment. So He was providing a way of escape from judgment, but not ultimate judgment for the time being. And we'll talk more about that later on. Now, the Ten Commandments were meant to show the Israelites what they were, what they really were inside, that they could never approach God in a way that they thought, and they could never to do it, because God's requirements for them to approach Him or for them to be justified in His sight was they had to live an absolutely perfect life. They could never violate one of those commands from the time they were born till the time they died. But we know that never happens. All of us fall short of that, and we just mess up and do on. He wanted them to realize that in order to please Him, the only requirement they could that He required was that they come to Him on His terms. And part of that was once they realized that they couldn't do it, then that their only hope was in this deliverer who would come to take care of that issue for them once and for all. So this lesson is going to kind of move us ahead in the story, and we're going to jump ahead a little bit, not lots. And by that, let me say this. There are several times where Moses goes up on the mountain, up to Sinai, and talks with God. And God reveals things to the Israelites as He went back and forth, some a little bit here, a little bit more there. And so I'm not going to deal with all the different times that He went up there. I'm just talking about the general terms right now of what God required. So in the last lesson, let's go back here a little bit. Now, we talked about the commands, the 10 commands. And the last lesson, we talked about the last 3 commands. The 8th command was, you shall not steal. So what He was telling the Israelites is that you cannot steal something from somebody else. You know, to steal something assumes property rights. So when people own things, when they work for it, that property becomes theirs. They've worked for it. They've earned their labor. And quite honestly, if you read anything by Adam Smith or Milton Friedman and talking about economics, what is property? But property is simply the amount of time you've invested in your life to purchase something. So when you steal something from somebody, you're not really just stealing that piece of property. You're stealing the amount of time that person took out of their lives to earn money in order to pay for that thing. So what you're doing is stealing part of their life, that which they invested in that. And so He says, don't steal. You're not allowed to take something that's somebody else's unless they voluntarily give it to you in a willing way, one where they wanted to. If they give it to you, that's fine, but you're not to take it without their permission. The 9th command was, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And the point there is that you're not to say anything false about your neighbor that's not true. At the same time, you're not to say anything about your neighbor that would appear true when you know it to be false. So either one is bearing false witness against your neighbor. If you've done something and you know, like let's say we take the previous command, if you knew that a person stole something, yet you say to the authorities, no, he didn't steal it, you're bearing false witness against your neighbor, because now you're covering up his crime. At the same time, if you say somebody stole something when they didn't, you're also bearing false witness against your neighbor. So those are things that God is concerned about. He is a God of truth. God demands the truth. That's why we have in our law, you shall tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. What? So help you God. And we talked about that, about not using the Lord's name in vain. So that would be another way you could use it, is to say something about somebody that you know is false, not necessarily that would hurt them, but even to help them if it's false is not right. Finally, the 10th command was, you shall not covet anything that is your neighbor's. Now, there's a bunch of things that are listed in there, but let's just take this idea. Anything that's your neighbor's, you're not to covet. So now God is even dealing with the motives behind taking something, not just the actual taking the action of it, but he's actually dealing with the deep down motives of what you want that somebody else has, not being content with what God has given you. That's what it talks about in coveting. So, going through that now, God calls Moses up to the mountain, and he wants to give him his commandments that are written in stone. Okay, those 10 commandments. So in Exodus 24:12, it says this, Then the Lord said to Moses, Come up to me on the mountain and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone and the law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. Okay, now interesting thing here. See, God is bringing this thing up, and he's going to write it in stone. That's where that term comes from. Hey, it's not written in stone. In other words, if you make an agreement and you don't know for sure if it's going to be binding, you just say it's not written in stone. And it comes from this particular event. That's where that term comes from. So he calls Moses up. He says, I'm going to put these commands in stone. Now, I want to emphasize this a little bit, because we talk about the 10 commandments being written in stone, and there's a reason that they're written in stone. It's because if it's written in stone or written that way, then it doesn't change. You see, man can change his word. He can give his interpretation, his belief about something. But if something is written down and it's recorded in a way that they can't change, then it's binding, because you can look at it and say, oh, that's what that person said. They didn't actually say this, or they did say this. But God, what he's saying is, I'm going to put these in stone so that everybody can see it. It won't change. And that's what the picture he's trying to give here. So, and remember, he wanted to give Moses the terms of the contract with Israel. One, if they obeyed, he would bless them. If Israel decided not to obey him, he would curse them. And Israel agreed when they signed on the dotted line by saying, all that he says we will do. That was the initial contract that God had with Israel. But now he's going to give them that contract in stone. So they did a verbal contract. Now he's going to do a physical contract. It would not be open to misinterpretation when he puts it that way. And like I said, this is where the term written in stone comes from. It would not deteriorate like paper or leather or something like that. In stone, it would stay and stay and stay and stay and stay. It would be, the picture he's given is something that's perpetual. It would never fade away. So that's what he's saying. This thing was written in stone. God's law could not change, and his decision would be final. So God is the author of this law. Therefore, it is binding upon the nature of God himself, and he wouldn't change it. The 10 Commandments now are also a framework for the rest of the commandments. Remember how in the beginning, on verse 1 of Genesis, it says this, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what he's saying there is that isn't the end of the thing. He creates it and then starts with all these things. What he's given is a general statement. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Then the rest of the days, he is explaining, he is telling us in detail how he created the heavens and the earth. Okay? So he's doing that. So first he makes a general statement, then he fills in all the gaps. He fills in all the details. He did the same with, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the earth, and so on and so forth. He gives a general statement, but then he gets done and he fills in gaps. He fills in the details. I shouldn't say gaps. He fills in the details with Adam and Eve and creating them and so on. And so now he's kind of doing the same thing. The 10 Commandments are the general framework in which all the other commands would be given. And none of the commands that came after it could ever violate any of those 10. They would be the framework. All property rights laws would be in detail what they would be. But the whole idea of it was, thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's goods, and so on, and wife and husband, and whatever. So they were a framework for the rest of the commandments, like I said, in Genesis 1:1, Genesis 1:28 for Adam and Eve. So Moses went up to the mountain to meet with God, and he did this for a period of time. Let's see what it says. Exodus 24, verses 13 through 18. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. And he said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you. If any man has a difficulty, let him go to them." Then Moses went up into the mountain, and a cloud covered the mountain. Now the glory of the Lord rested on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the 7th day he called to Moses out of the middle of the cloud. And the sight of the glory of the Lord was like a consuming fire on the top of the mountain in the eyes of the children of Israel. So Moses went into the midst of the cloud and went up into the mountain. And Moses was on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So he was there for quite a while. Now it's interesting. I kind of noticed something here, and I'll get to it here in just a second, but I think you'll like this. Now Moses obeyed and left instructions for the Israelites while he was to be gone. So he says, I'm going to be gone for a period of time. I don't know how long, but I'm going to be gone, and here's what you need to do while I'm gone. Aaron and Hur are here, and they can handle any disputes or issues that come up. You just let them take care of them. Now Joshua went up with Moses, but he only went so far. Joshua stopped at a certain point, and Moses continued on up into the cloud. So he was there and was going to be there for that time. Moses said that he and Joshua would return. Now, you know, I don't know what it sounded like when I heard this. I'd never noticed this before, but it sounded like Abraham and Isaac talking to Abraham's servants. Remember when Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac? He says, my son and I will go up there and worship, and he says, and we will return to you. And it kind of sounds like this, that almost Moses knew what was going to happen. Moses said, wait for us until we come back to you. Indeed, Aaron and Hur are with you until we come back to you. So kind of the same thing. Now Moses waited 7 days. He was there for 6 days, and on the 7th day, the Lord called him out of the cloud and says, come up to me. And went. So he wanted to go up there. So Moses waited 7 days for the Lord to summon him. And then Moses was up in that cloud for 40 days and 40 nights. And Joshua was up there also. I don't know if they took any food with them or whatever they did, but they were there that whole time for 40 days and 40 nights, and all the Israelites were down below waiting to hear what God had to say to Moses. So God gave Moses his 10 commandments in stone while he was up there. Okay? So he went up there and did that. So God commanded Moses to build a tabernacle, a place to meet with the people of Israel. So while he was up there, God's giving his instructions. He says, listen, if people are going to come to me, like even in the Old Testament with Cain and Abel, there was an altar and they sacrificed to the Lord. It was an altar that was made of stones. And anyway, you'll figure out later on, because of some other things that happen, what God's requirements are. Anyway, so they met with God. There were altars built. Abraham built an altar and so on. And now God's saying, if people are going to come to me and meet with me, then here's what you need to do. You need to build something. We're going to call it a tabernacle. And that tabernacle, you have to build it exactly to the pattern that you see in heaven. So there was a tabernacle evidently in heaven. And Moses was to see this and build it according to that pattern. All right? Not something that he wanted to dream up on his own. It was something that God himself required. So, it says this. Here's what it says in Exodus chapter 25, verses 1 through 8. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel, that they bring me an offering. From everyone who gives it willingly with his heart, you shall take my offering. And this is the offering which you shall take from them: gold, silver, and bronze, and blue, purple, and scarlet thread, fine linen, and goat's hair, ram skins dyed red, badger skins, and acacia wood, oil for the light, and spices for the anointing oil, and for a sweet incense, onyx stones, and stones to be set in the ephod and in the breastplate. You will see that later on. That's where the high priest had this thing in the center of his path. It had 12 stones, but anyway, that's what was be the. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. So God is telling the people, I want them to gather all that stuff that they brought with them from Egypt. All those different things where they said that they would spoil Egypt. They would go there and they would take all these possessions from Egypt, a lot of them, and the people gave it willingly, the Egyptians. All of his stuff, what God had them bring for a purpose. And as part of it was to build his tabernacle. So that's what he was doing there. So what was God's purpose in having the tabernacle built? One, God did not want to destroy Israel. Had there not been a place where you could approach God in a way that God wanted, God would have had to destroy Israel because they were rebellious anyway. God was reminding them who he was and that he alone had the right to set the rules for human behavior and redemption for that matter. Okay? Only he had the right to say how people could be redeemed. God knew that they would not be able to keep his law, and so that's another reason why he's having them build this. And God provided a way for them to approach him before the deliverer came. So this deliverer who he promised way back in Genesis 3:15 and to Abraham and all these different things, God is providing a way for them to approach him until the deliverer could come. All right? The tabernacle would be the very thing that would remind them of that. Every time they would go to the tabernacle, go and meet with God there, it would remind them of their need to trust in God and trust in the promise that he made of a deliverer who would one day come. The tabernacle could not contain God. God is everywhere. He's omnipresent. So there's nowhere that God isn't. So it wouldn't contain God. It was just a place where Israelites could meet with God. And by Israelites, we're going to explain a little bit more about that, about what that was. It was a place where all people who wanted to approach God would have to come. Made no difference whether they were Jewish or Gentile or whatever. If they wanted to come to God, they would have to come to this place and to this particular building, this little tabernacle that God would have them build. Okay, Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3 say this, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all families of the earth shall be blessed. Remember, that's the promise that he gave to Abraham, that God gave to Abraham. So he is starting to fulfill this, but in you, all families of the earth shall be blessed, all nations. So they would come to this place, and they would honor God by coming to this place and making the proper sacrifice. And they had to do it according to God's standard, God's rules, if you want to put it that way. And the tabernacle had to be built exactly as God had commanded. Exodus 25:9 says this, according to all that I show you, that is, the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, just so you shall make it. In other words, you have to make it exactly as I'm telling you. So make it according to the pattern that you see in heaven. So I once asked a friend of mine, we were at a big church, a friend of mine was part of this big church, and we were talking about it, and he says, the church is built in such a way so that when you walk into the place, you look up as though, and the idea is, the purpose of it was to get you to look up as though you were looking at God. And so I asked him, I said, who built this building? And he told me the name of the man who designed it and everything. And so I remember I asked him who designed, we walked outside not too long later, and there was this beautiful sunset out there. And I asked him, I says, well, who built that? Or he says, who designed that? He said, well, God did. I says, you see, when God does something, he gets the credit. But when man does something, man gets the credit. No matter how beautiful it is, what the thing is, man will always get the credit for man's works. Nobody would walk into a church and say, God built this church. You know, they may like to say that God did by providing money, but when it comes to the building, everybody builds according to their own ideas. But when God builds something, there is no doubt about who built it, whose hand was in it. Nobody's hand was in it. God did it himself. And that's why it says that the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, and night unto night shows knowledge. There is no voice where their language is not heard. So we look up into the sky and we see, wow, God did that. He did that, and only he did that. Nobody can get credit for it other than him. So God does not share credit with anything or anyone that he creates, nor should he. God, nobody else should give it. This is the difference between God and man creating. God, when he creates, he gets the credit. When man creates, he gets the credit also. When we talk about the World Trade Center, we talk about the person that built it, and we honor him for doing it, but we know he's the one that built it. He designed it. But once again, the difference with him and God is God creates something out of nothing. Man creates something out of things that God created already. It was already there. So, anyway, now within this tabernacle, though, there were 2 rooms, and they were very, very special rooms. One was called the Holy Place. The other place was called the Most Holy Place. And so in the Most Holy Place, there was also 2 objects, or there was, 2 objects that had to be in there. One was the Ark, and what we call the Ark of the Covenant, and the mercy seat. The Ark contained the mercy seat, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later, about what that's like and its purpose. So Exodus 25, verses 9 through 11, it says this: according to all that I show you, that is, the pattern of the tabernacle and the pattern of all its furnishings, just so you shall make it. And they shall make an ark of acacia wood, 2.5 cubits shall be its length, which is a cubit is about 18 inches. So you get anyway, you figure it out. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width, and 1.5 cubits its height. And you shall overlay it with pure gold, inside and out you shall overlay it, and shall make on it a molding of gold all around. So this Ark of the Covenant here, that this one is going to be a specific thing. It's going to be like a box that made of a certain type of wood, and it would be overlaid with gold inside and out, and then there would be this border around the top of it. And it was a very special place. It said the ark was to only be in the most holy place. That's where it would be. It was not to be in the holy place. It was to be in the most holy place, the really separate room. It's a place where God would appear. God would come, and he would appear there. It's a place where the blood would be sprinkled. So, and you'll learn more about that as time goes on, but when the priest would come in, and we talked about without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. This blood would be sprinkled on the mercy seat. And then the 10 Commandments were to be put inside this box, this golden box, this Ark of the Covenant. And on top of that was a lid, and on top of that there were these cherubim. Remember the cherubim? We mentioned those in the Garden of Eden. They were there with a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life. There would be these things of cherubim that were there, and their wings would come over and almost touch right there, and then God would dwell in between that place. That's where he would be at. Exodus 25, verses 17 through 20. You shall make a mercy seat of pure gold. 2.5 cubits shall be its length, and 1.5 cubits its width. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. Of hammered work you shall make them at the 2 ends of the mercy seat. Make 1 cherub at one end, and the other cherub at the other end. You shall make the cherubim at the 2 ends of it of one piece with the mercy seat. So this whole thing, the whole top of this lid was of gold, but the cherubim were made of pure gold, and they would be all one piece with the lid. Can you imagine how heavy that must have been? 2 ends, one piece of the mercy seat. And the cherubim shall stretch out their wings above, covering the mercy seat with their wings. And they shall face one another. The faces of the cherubim shall be toward the mercy seat, so they'd be looking down at it. Now remember, the cherubim, there isn't a lot said about them, but it seems as though they are always there guarding the holiness of God. It isn't as though God needed any help or anything like that, but they were pictures of something, the holiness of God, that nothing was to approach that or violate that. So they were there covering the mercy seat. That's where God would execute his mercy, if you want to put it that way. Even though God wanted the tabernacle to be built correctly, it was because he wanted it to, though God wanted let me see, I'm sorry here. Let me change that bit here. God wanted the tabernacle to be correctly. Why? Because it was he wanted it to reflect the nature of God correctly. That was the point. The tabernacle represented the designer. And so whatever we saw, and the whole tabernacle, all of it, the whole building, the structure, all of it was to say something about God himself. There were pictures within that building. They were and I don't know how the proper word to use for it, but all of it was to represent who God was in some way or another. And sometimes there would be things about it that we would have to find out later on. And maybe some of it we'll just have to wait till we get to heaven to find those things out. The mercy seat is where God would appear and show his mercy on the people of Israel and anybody else who came for that matter. More will be revealed later on in this area. Now, God told Moses to place the commandments inside the box, inside the Ark of the Covenant, and cover it with the mercy seat, and place the mercy seat in the most holy place. So that's what they were to do. All right? Exodus 25, verses 21 and 22 says this, "You shall put the mercy seat on top of the ark, and in the ark you shall put the testimony that I will give you." In other words, the Ten Commandments. "And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim, which are on the ark of the testimony, about everything which I will give you in commandment to the children of Israel." So Moses would, not Moses, but that's where God would speak to the people of Israel, from that mercy seat. Now, there was another area in there, another section in there that's also very important, and it was called the veil, or the curtain. And it was a big, really, really thick, big curtain that separated the place between the holy place and the most holy place. And that was a really interesting thing, and it was a picture. Nobody could enter into there except the high priest. And we'll talk about him in a minute. Only the high priest could go in there behind the curtain. Now, none of this has been built yet. It's on the process. But he's getting instructions on what to do. All right? And then he says this. God says, "You shall make a veil woven of blue, purple, and scarlet thread, and fine woven linen. It shall be woven with an artistic design of cherubim." In other words, cherubim were to be designed into this curtain. "You shall hang it upon the 4 pillars of acacia wood overlaid with gold. Their hooks shall be of gold upon 4 sockets of silver. And you shall hang the veil from the clasps. Then you shall bring the ark of the testimony in there behind the veil. The veil shall be a divider for you between the holy place and the most holy." So that whole idea, once again, is that that curtain would separate the most holy place from the holy place. All right? No one could pass into this the most holy place except the high priest. One person. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyone who tried to enter into that area that wasn't the high priest would die. Even the high priest would die if he didn't enter in according to the pattern God told him to. All right? God had to be approached in the way God demanded. That's what he's saying. So then there was another thing called the bronze altar. And this bronze altar, well, let's read it here. Exodus 20, verse 1 and 2. "You shall make an altar of acacia wood, 5 cubits long and 5 cubits wide. The altar shall be square, and its height shall be 3 cubits. You shall make its horns on its 4 corners. Its horns shall be of one piece with it, and you shall overlay it with bronze." So this bronze altar is where everything's going to be sacrificed, all right? All offerings were to be made on this bronze altar. Okay. So Leviticus, going to another book that kind of explains this a little fuller. In Leviticus chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, it says this, "Now the Lord called to Moses and spoke to him from the tabernacle of meeting, saying, Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd of the flock. It is if his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle of meeting before the Lord. Then he shall put his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it will be accepted on his behalf to make atonement for him. He shall kill the bull before the Lord, and the priests, Aaron's sons, shall bring the blood and sprinkle the blood all around the altar that is by the door of the tabernacle of meeting." So it's given us a little bit. This is what I just read to you is after the fact. The tabernacle's all built and everything, and he's given instructions on now how we're going to start this work. So we're doing that. So you've learned a couple things there. The requirements of the sacrifice had to be these. It had to be an animal. It was to be a male. It was to be without blemish. It couldn't have any scars or cuts or anything like that. It couldn't be deformed or anything. It had to be a perfect sacrifice. A person was to offer it of his own free will, not under compulsion. He was to bring it to the door of the tabernacle. He was to put his hands on the head of the offering, okay? That symbolized, I am admitting I'm a sinner and this sacrifice is taking my place. That's what it meant. He was to put his hands on the head of the sacrifice. The sacrifice would take the place of the person offering the sacrifice. He would kill the sacrifice and its blood would be shed. He would do it in front of the Lord and the priests, and the priests would then take the blood and sprinkle it all around the altar, which was located at the door of the courtyard. All right? Putting his hand on the head of the sacrifice was an admission of guilt. That's what we just talked about. The innocent animal died in the place of sinful men. God's telling us something here. The priest would then take the blood and sprinkle it all around on the altar, which was located at the door of the courtyard. There are reasons that he did all that, and God had that required. I don't understand. I'll just admit to you right now, I don't understand all of the aspects of that. All I know is this. If God says to do something, you better do it the way he tells you. He knows what he's doing. He has the requirement. He has the right to set the rules. He's the creator, all right? The animal will be a substitute for man until the deliverer would come. Okay, that's the interesting thing that we need to remember. All of this that they're doing would never take away their sins. All it was doing is they were holding off God's wrath until the deliverer would come, and the deliverer would take care of this issue. Could the animal take the person's sin away? Of course not. Sin must be paid for by the sinner unless there was a substitute for him, and the animal was a picture of the deliverer who would one day come. That's something we have to remember. Now, God chose Aaron and his sons to serve him as priests, all right? So Moses' brother Aaron was of the tribe of Levi, and only of the tribe of Levi would the priests come from. No other tribe, whether it's Reuben or Simeon or Judah or Benjamin or any of those things like that, none of them could come as priests, only from the tribe of Levi, or Levi, however you want to pronounce it. Aaron would be the high priest, and his sons would be priests. So the high priest was the one who could enter into the most holy place. The priests did all the other work inside the holy place, outside in the courtyard, the different places that were there. All the priests did that type of work, but only one person could enter into the most holy place. He did it once a year and twice on one day. First, he took care of his sins. He offered sacrifice for his own sins. Then he offered sacrifice for the people. But we may be learning more about that a little bit later. So God chose Aaron to be the high priest. Now, it says there in Acts 28, verse 1. Exodus. Now take Aaron your brother and his sons with him from among the children of Israel, that he may minister to me as priest. Aaron and Aaron's sons, Nadab, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. Now, only Aaron and other high priests can enter the most holy place. So whoever would be designated after Aaron as a high priest could be the one to enter in. The other, like I said, other priests served in other capacities in the temple, but not in the most holy place. And only the high priest could sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat. He was the only one that could do it. Like I said, he did it once a year and twice on that one day. Now, Leviticus 16:15 says this, and he shall kill the goat of the sin offering, which is for the people, bring its blood inside the veil, do with that blood as he did with the blood of the bull, and sprinkle it upon the mercy seat before the mercy seat. So the atonement would have to be repeated every year by the high priest. And so it had to be done. It was a perpetual sacrifice that happened once a year, every year, from that point on. So there were only two choices concerning the payment for sin. And everybody was a sinner, and that was the whole point of the tabernacle, is to remind people that they were sinners, but that God also, in his mercy and grace, had provided a way for them not to be destroyed. They just needed to do what he told them to do. Remember, that was the agreement that they made with God. The two choices, they could come to God on their own terms and be separated from him forever. That was one of the choices. Or they could come to God on God's terms and and because of what the deliverer would accomplish for sinners, recognizing him as the only hope that they have. So in other words, they could come on their own terms, which meant destruction, or they could come on God's terms, which meant blessing, and that one day a deliverer would come who would ultimately take care of this issue once and for all. But for now, this was just something that would be repeated year after year after year to remind them that they were sinners, but to remind them that God was gracious and to remind them that he would provide a way. That's what they needed to do. So which choice do you think that they're going to make? Now that the tabernacle's built, now he's given all the instructions, now they're getting ready to start this whole process out. What choice do you think they're going to make? Knowing their history, what do you think? Well, we'll learn more about that. Thanks again. This is kind of a long lesson, and because there's just stuff in here that had to be taught, I'm sorry it took so long, but that's okay. Just remember, if you have a friend that wants to listen to this, feel free. Please have them sign up, subscribe for my audio podcast. They can just go on their favorite podcast app and look up the Premature Bible Institute. And if they want to watch the video podcast, they can just get onto YouTube and look under my name, Doug Scheibel. Doug space Scheibel, Scheibble. Thank you guys so much. We'll talk to you next week. Bye.